Most people let their camera decide everything for them. But when you learn manual mode, you take control. You decide how the shot looks, not the camera. Today I'm giving you a complete guide to mastering manual mode. After this, you will never want to shoot in auto mode again. So let's dive in. Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are diving into how you can start shooting in the manual mode. Shooting in manual mode is quite difficult for most of us, especially if you're a newbie. We tend to shoot in either the auto mode or the aperture or the shutter priority mode. Though aperture priority and shutter priority are a good start, manual mode is something which will give you a complete creative freedom. When I started photography, I was mainly shooting in the aperture mode, but in the recent years, I have shifted to the manual mode, and this is something which has given me a lot of creative freedom. And nowadays, I find it easy to shoot in manual mode than in any other mode. By the way, if you're new to this channel, I'm Anshu, a photographer for 15 years. I post videos weekly about everything photography. Please do subscribe to see more content like this. Manual mode gives you a complete freedom whether you're shooting portraits, landscape, or any kind of photography, and even videos. You will be able to control the exposure, the depth of field, and even the movements in your photograph. To understand manual mode, you need to master three very basic things about exposure triangle. They are the shutter, the ISO, and the aperture. These three basic principles of exposure helps in determining how you're going to illuminate your camera sensor. Think of ISO as your camera sensitivity to light. Low ISO will give you a cleaner image with less noise. Higher ISO gives you a brighter image but with more noise. Shutter speed controls how long the shutter stays open. Remember, faster shutter means freezing motion, while slower shutter means you create motion blur. Aperture controls depth of field. A lower f number means more blur and more light reaching your sensor, while higher f number means narrower depth of field and more areas of image being in focus. So once you know about these three basic principles of exposure, we will now move into how you can utilize and put this into practice in the manual mode. Let's first understand aperture, which gives you a creative control over the depth of field in your photo. Generally, in most photography, it is easier to determine what the depth of field is going to be for your subject. For example, if you're shooting portraits, you would want the focus to be on your subject and maybe have a blurred background. But the opposite would be true in the case of landscape, where you would want more of your image to be in focus. So in such cases and such scenarios, it is always easier to focus on the aperture first. And we will decide our aperture based on how out of focus or in focus you want your subject and the background to be. For example, to keep your background completely out of focus, we will choose a f number which is lower in value. Say for example 1.8 or even 2.8. In case of landscape, the opposite would be true because we want more of the scene to be in focus. Then we go ahead and choose an aperture which is higher in number. For example, f12 or f16 or even f22 if your camera lens allows that. So a general rule of thumb would be in scenarios where you have an idea of what your depth of field is going to be, we first go ahead and choose the f number. So a smaller f number for scenes like portraits and a larger f number for scenes like landscape. Let's now start experimenting with the shutter once you already have decided on your aperture value. If, for example, say you're in a very harsh lighting situation and your f number is going to be very low, like f1.8, then your scene is already bright enough. So you need to choose a higher shutter value, say something like 1 by 2000 of a second or 1 by even 5000 of a second. I know all this may sound a little bit confusing, but stay with me. If you're able to understand the relation between shutter and aperture and start experimenting a bit, you're already halfway through the manual mode. So coming back to the shutter, once you know a kind of a range in which you want to keep your shutter, then you can use a lot of cameras inbuilt features, say like a histogram, to see whether your subject or your scene is overexposed or underexposed. I tend to keep the exposure somewhat in the middle, which is shown by more or less flat curves in your histogram. If your histogram goes a lot on the right, it means your image is getting overexposed. Then we will start increasing the shutter speed. If your histogram tends to move more towards the left, it means your image is getting underexposed. In such scenarios, I will decrease my shutter speed, say something around 1 by 500 of a second. And this kind of a trial and error, I know it may sound a little daunting in the beginning, but once you start experimenting with few photographs, you will get a general idea in terms of what values of aperture and shutter to set for your next photograph. So this kind of approach really works well with most of your general purpose photography, like landscape, portraits, product photography, even wildlife, when you know how your subject is going to be, and most likely it will be stationary. But what if you're stuck in a low light situation, say like night photography or even blue hour photography where the light is really low? Then we can start experimenting with lower shutter speed. So we are going to apply the same rule of thumb. We will first go ahead and choose the aperture depending on the depth of field which you want to create, and if your image starts getting underexposed, then we will start going ahead and reducing the shutter speed. Now, a good rule of thumb for me is I will not go with a shutter speed less than 1 by 100 if I'm hand holding the camera. If I go, say, for a shutter speed less than 1 by 100, then I tend to use a tripod. If you feel your shutter is going too low to keep the exposure well balanced, then we will start experimenting with the ISO. Most cameras these days have very good ISO sensitivity. That means that even if you go ahead and increase your ISO to a higher value, you are going to get less noise in your photos. But a good rule of thumb still is going to be, don't go ahead with very high ISO number, say for example more than 5000, because you will start seeing lots of grain in your image. And remember, this is where the auto mode severely lacks. If you go ahead and experiment today in low light situation, I bet your camera will raise the ISO instead of going with a slower shutter speed. So we are now in a situation where we want to create light trails or motion in your photos. This is when I will start actually choosing a shutter first. Say for example, if I want to create a light trails of a moving bus or a car, then I would go ahead and choose a shutter speed, say of 1 second or even maybe 5 seconds. And this is where now we will do it reverse and start comparing the f number with your shutter. So you can go with a higher f number, say 5.6, f8 or even f11, and still keeping an eye on the histogram to see if your image is getting underexposed or overexposed. And this is a very good technique when you want to depict motion in your photos. You're going to choose the shutter first instead of the aperture. These are very specialized photography, but I know a lot of photographers really want to create light trails or have that kind of motion depicted in photography, which is where choosing a shutter speed comes really into picture. Okay, for most of the scenarios we just saw now, we knew how the subject would behave or even move or how the lighting condition is going to be. But what about situations where you cannot predict anything? You even don't know what your subject is going to be. Then how do we deal with manual mode in such scenarios? An ideal example of this is going to be street photography. Here the light changes constantly, your subjects are unpredictable, and you have got only seconds to capture the right image. So the best way to approach is to still follow some of the general guidelines which we discussed till now. Now, if you're shooting during the daytime, then try to gauge a little bit about the lighting situation and your environment. Try to get an average lighting value of your scene. And this is definitely going to come with experience once you have practiced a lot of shutter and aperture combinations in still portraits or even still life. Let's say I'm in a very sunny situation, a street environment, and in such scenarios, it becomes easier to decide on an aperture value because you have two options. Either you want to have a shallow depth of field in your scene and focusing on a particular subject, or you want to have a more narrower field of depth and you want to have a lot of elements in focus in the scene. So I am still going to go ahead and decide on my F number before, and then using my judgment I will go and choose and experiment with few of the shutter values. One thing which really helps me in such scenarios is I do a lot of pre-focusing. By pre-focusing, what I mean is I in general try to compose my scene first. Say for example, in this scene I composed and prepared the exposure, aiming to focus on the wall, and then I let my subject move into the frame before I click this snap. And that's about it. I hope these simple techniques and step-by-step guide will help you to move into a manual shooting mode. Manual mode takes a little practice, but once you get it, your photography will start improving fast. Remember always to choose your priority first in terms of whether you want it to be the shutter or whether you want it to be the aperture, and then think about the ISO always in the end. Let me know in the comments below if you ever shoot in manual mode and what is your biggest challenge while shooting in the manual mode. And if this video helped, then please do consider subscribing to my channel. I'm aiming at 1,000 subscribers soon, and you subscribing will really help me a lot. I will see you in another video very soon. Till then, bye.